Hello, class. This is our presentation data set. So it's on women, business, and the law. We are Linda, Luis, Andrea, and Elizabeth, and let's get this started. So our agenda for today, we have the intro, then we're going to go in detail in terms of like what the data is that we have researched, our purpose, our key factors and constraints, our exploration of data and what we found, our results of it all, and what we conclude, and our references. So a little bit about our data set. So it varies from like different countries, from like Afghanistan, and then it ends up to Zimbabwe. But in terms of women laws vary within different countries and region, and that is true. Within that data set that we all found interesting, is there's questions within the data set. And can a woman choose where to live in the same way as a man? Does the law prohibit discrimination in employment based on gender? Is there paid leave available for fathers? We also took into account, although we're researching on what a woman, but and then in their laws, but it's also like, is it like, fathers? We didn't go too much in detail, but it's just the comparison. Can a woman open a bank account in the same way as a man? Is the law free of legal provisions that require a married woman to obey her husband? And in that question, it could be a little bit more in terms of like, yes, some countries do, in terms of like the law, and some countries like it doesn't, like it gives it more women freedom. And then on my next slide, it's more of the data set. So the data set, the visual, it goes, like I said, it goes from from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, a total of 190 countries, 7 regions. So it has from like different variety of, from like even the economic status that we found interesting, like from like the low income to like the high medium income. And then our key columns within this data set is the mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pensions. And then as you can see, there's also questions within like the next column. So like the questions that I was referring to. And then the timeline of this data set is from 1971 to 2024. And of course, laws have changed within that course of the years from like 1971, and you know, a woman didn't have much rights, but to now having that women have rights and they can defend themselves. And within this presentation, we're going to be learning and exploring. So thank
So our main purpose was to analyze how gender inequality limits women's rights and freedoms across the regions. One of the focuses that we had was to identify gaps in women's access to capital and possessions when compared to men. Some key dimensions that we noticed or we used when doing these comparisons were taking into account the country's income level and asset scores. And the method that we used was comparing equity questions in the data set with economic standing of each country. The overall outcome that we wanted to gain from this was to show how inequality impacts women's opportunities and everyday lives.
Interpreting the dataset on women's rights requires careful consideration of both the dataset's limitations and the cultural biases that we may bring to this analysis. The dataset captures the existence of laws, but not effectively if they are enforced or not. It also really simplifies the complex realities into one single score for an entire country. This oversimplification can potentially overlook demographic gaps for which it represents, such as age groups, differences in the amount of males versus females, or representation for marginalized populations in scores. There's also restraints in the data collection, such as access to accurate information in countries where strict governments limit the access to true facts and represent what they want other nations to see. Additionally, regional, political, and economic disparities also shape the data and may not all be reflected. High-income countries tend to have removed legal barriers earlier, while progress has been a bit slower in lower-income countries. Viewing this data through a US-centric lens can introduce additional culture and interpretive bias, such as assumptions about gender roles and the expectation that women seek equal rights to manage assets and finances. And this may not hold true in cultural and contextual factors that influence how women's rights translate into real world access to economic opportunities.
So, hi everybody. My name is Luis. Upon exploring some of the data, as an aggregate, really what we've taken a look at is, we've kind of compiled a couple of points here, and really we're taking a look at legal reforms that have slowed over the course of the years. Pace of gender equal legal reforms have declined since the 2010s, and that's kind of what the trends are showing. And most progress we've seen for gender equality has come from mobility, workplace entry, and entrepreneurship. We've seen the least progress in pay equality and parental leave, as well as childcare support, which we'll see in the coming slides here. But implementation gaps are the largest in low and middle income economies, which means there isn't much of an effort to implement policies or legislation that will protect or create frameworks to protect women in the workplace, especially when it comes to remuneration. Economic benefits are at stake, which means that gender equal laws are linked to higher female labor force participation in economic growth. So target legal reform in lagging countries. This is kind of one of the first steps as far as what we can do to really address these disparities. We're going to focus on low and lower middle income economies that still lack equal pay laws. What else can we do? We can support institutional capacity building. So we can fund labor inspection systems and gender equality commissions in weaker economies. We can also introduce wage transparency policies. So what does this mean? I mean, really audit the process, audit the auditor as well, right? Like make sure that these processes and systems are in place to report gender pay gaps and pay practices. Another thing that we can do is encourage international alignment. So we can push for ratification of ILO Equal Remuneration Convention where it's not adopted. So this is a convention that was initially met in 1971 to ensure alliance and alignment of pay standards across the board and promote private sector accountability. This is another one where multinationals can use WBA, women business and law data to ensure fair pay in global supply chains. So moving on to the next slide. Go ahead.
So we examined the data set through a financial lens and asked, is gender equality and authority over asset management impacted by the economy of the region? And we noticed a trend between the presence of a law in a country that gives women equal rights than those of a man in terms of financial matters, and they parallel the country's asset score and economy. The higher the wealth of the country, the more likely a law exists to decrease the gap in disparity. So as you could see here, 87% of high income regions have laws. In contracts, in high income versus low income, it's only 57% that do not have the laws supporting the equity. So this comes in parallel to the progress of a nation. So the higher the wealth of the country, the more likely a law exists and to decrease the gap in the disparity and equality between men and women. So although there are a few exceptions, the vast majority of low-income countries have not implemented laws that provide women access or authority to assets in ways that they do for men. The scores analyzed are based on the average of each nation's economy and income scores between the years of 1974 to 2024. So this takes into consideration the speed of lower economy regions into implementing the laws in comparison to the higher economy regions. And even with this fact considered, there are more high income regions with laws that allow the women these rights in comparison. So this analysis demonstrates that the region's economy does in fact impact gender equality in regards to asset management authority from 1974 to 2020.
So another question that we asked ourselves was, does regional and federal national law on equal remuneration have an impact on correlation on impact or a correlation on income group? So what does this mean? Well, essentially what we have to understand first is the pay score. And a pay score really tells you whether national laws mandate equality in pay between men and women for work of equal value. So essentially it reflects legal protections against gender-based pay discrimination, right? So if we take a look at this chart, the question is, does the law require equal remuneration for work of equal value for women? And if we take a look at no, we can see that the pay scores for high income economies are nonetheless, they're always going to be higher, right? So that's because they have higher protections for individuals, for essentially economies or women in these cases. So, and we can also see a trend of, lower income countries or regions like East Asia and the Pacific in particular that are not, and it's almost an inverse relationship whether or not they're actually there's a higher pay score and income, or sorry, regional grouping. So we can take a look at the low income, and there is very little data to support that there actually is not only a yes on the law requiring equal remuneration, but also data on high income individuals or even lower income for high income OECD countries. And these are countries like the United States, Germany, and higher income economy groups. Um, we can also take a look at the next slide, in which the law does actually mandate, and it's substantially higher for higher income economies where pay score and payer protections are actually higher and more prevalent for women rather than lower income countries. So that's some of the insight into what we've seen. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And so, kind of as a trend, we've seen that in the 1970s, only 2 countries had equal remuneration laws. Some key takeaways now, 98 economies do. High income countries lead in adopting and enforcing equal pay laws, as we've seen in the charts above. Lower income countries show slower adoption, weaker implementation capacity. Again, that's pretty obvious given the charts that we've seen. Lower, equality and essentially auditing systems to prevent, lack of enforcement of these systems. Enforcement gaps remain a key challenge. Even where laws exist, many lack mechanisms for accountability. Again, auditing. Regional disparities align with economic groups. Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, South Asia, MENA lag behind Europe and Latin America.
Within the next question that we kind of digress was, how have changes in labor laws influenced women opportunities across countries and regions from the years 1974 to 2024, or within that range of the data set? So within that conclusion, it kind of focused on, do labor laws help women and men find employment equally? So since my questions are more the gender, well, either the female or the male, so within the laws, the workplace is protected, and the marriage, it's where like the freedom of movement, and so that's where like the laws come in play. So freedom of movement of a woman to decide what she wants to do within the marriage, or like ending obedience of spouse, meaning that, like, again, it depends and varies for region and by country. Some regions, countries, they still like the women, based on the law, they still have to obey the men. And then, but that kind of help protect it in some way, shape, or form. The family and parental, that's where the strongest gaps in terms of like, you can see the inequality between those two, like parental in terms of like, um can a father have, I think one question that I saw is like, can a father have the same parental leave in terms of the mother? And some other countries and regions were saying no. I was like, oh, so like within the labor laws, within the men and the female, they're a lot different. The pay is where it was steady at one point, and then but from 2022 and on, it kind of like, you'll see that it kind of improved. And it was more like something that like, oh, the woman's improvements or their work history kind of helped them get equal pay. And so that's what I kind of focused in terms of like, yes, the labor laws help influence women's opportunities, because the labor laws has to do with workplace, and then with the pay, like how much are they getting paid, and does the law prohibit discrimination in employment based on gender? Hard yes, if you, on the graph is more like the East Asia, the Europe, the high income, and then the no is where like the lower kind of middle class, like Middle East, South Asia. So there were some countries that kind of still kind of favor the labor laws for women and kind of don't. So there you'll see the different opportunities between the different countries, the regions, and what a woman can and cannot do. And yeah.
We also wanted to know in what ways do legal restrictions on women's mobility affect women's access to economic opportunities across countries and regions, all the way from 1974 to 2024. So the data set tracks how women's mobility rights, which is women's um, rights to move freely across like a residency, so choosing where to live, choosing where to travel, if the rights allow them to get and apply for a passport, as well as the workplace protection. So, is there laws that protect women from being discriminated during the hiring process, as well as preventing them from being harassed? A key trend that the data set demonstrated is that countries with stronger mobility rights consistently show a higher workplace protections. So, countries where women are allowed to move freely because of those protections and those rights, those same countries show that in the workplace, women have more protections compared to the countries where women are not free to move as they please. From the 1974 baseline, so since 1974, we noticed that the high income countries who scored a mobility score of 75 on average had a workplace score of 20 versus the low income countries who scored a mobility score of around 65 had a workplace score of around 15. But over time, so that was in 1974. However, over time, the OECD, and upper middle income countries advanced toward near universal mobility and equality. This means that where we see now mobility scores or high mobility scores, we'll see near workplace scores. So they are pretty equal. And while the low income regions remain behind. And our overall insight is that mobility rights are a foundation for economic opportunity, and removing restrictions on women often coincided with expanded workplace protections. So, for our conclusion, we believe that legal mobility is both a human right for men and women and a prerequisite for workplace equality.
In conclusion, the dataset Women, Business, and the Law 2024 has shown us through our data analysis that there is a great disparity in equity laws, favoring men and holding more limitations for women. There are countries that have created legislative reforms in areas for gender equity in financial decision making, mobility, employment, and pay. However, a lack of the enforcement of these laws may result in women continuing to experience barriers in these areas. Closing the legal gender gap is not only a global moral responsibility, but also an economic one. For asset and mobility laws, European, Central Asian, and Latin American countries are doing better from 1974 to 2024, but South Asian and the Middle Eastern countries are still behind with very little progress. The same can be said for pay and workplace laws, and all of these countries still require enforcement and transparency of these laws. A continued increase in legal equity, as well as the enforcement of these laws, can immensely boost women's opportunities to join the labor force and to enter entrepreneurship, continuing the growth in the country's economic status. So, in conclusion, we feel that a push for gender equity for both men and women is a push for global progress.